Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We're joined on the program today by former chief speechwriter at the Pentagon. He's also a D.C. insider, an expert on the military, as well as a master at explaining the insiders to the outsiders. We're going to discover something such as the National Security Council and find out how it became so powerful. So for those of you out there who are kind of looking over the horizon and thinking about the deep state as it's called, well, you might get a little feel for why you feel and think that way. Understanding the National Security Council is also tantamount to grasping the missing link of foreign policy. These are the people who help to influence the president's biggest decisions and why they're made. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book White House Warriors. This is how the National Security Council transformed the American way of war. John Gans joins us on the program. John, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, there's a lot going on here, and I couldn't help as I was reading through the book on different things here, going back to when I was growing up and Henry Kissinger, and thinking about who this guy was and how he shaped a lot what was going on, and you realize that through the decades, especially with the people that you've talked with and interviewed, people such as Dick Cheney, for instance, and you come to realize the kind of seat of power that these people seem to have. But first of all, for our listeners, let's describe what the National Security Council actually is all about.
Exactly. Well, now, happy to do that. And Kissinger is sort of, I think, when everybody sort of became, at least in the popular imagination, familiar with the NSC. But I always try to explain this to people, which is that Franklin Roosevelt won World War II without a National Security Council, but everybody in government thought he needed one, because Franklin Roosevelt did what he liked to call juggling, where he would basically lie and mislead and keep secrets to try to win the war on his own terms and in his own way. So he used a collection of small collection of aides. He basically communicated with Winston Churchill, and he only trusted a few military sort of leaders. But everybody else he basically kept in the dark, including his own vice president, Harry Truman, who, of course, wasn't even told about nuclear weapons until after Franklin Roosevelt passed away. And this juggling, Franklin Roosevelt's juggling, drove government crazy, right? Because at a time where you had a two-front giant war against enormous military powers, at a time where nuclear weapons were not known yet, but weapons themselves were growing far more powerful, at a time where government was getting huge. I mean, working at the Pentagon, I always like to tell people when I gave them tours, when friends and family would come, is that they built the Pentagon during World War II. Like, World War II is where the U.S. government, in terms of foreign policy, grew far larger. It was hard to think that somebody was fighting a relatively old man was fighting World War II, or at least trying to fight World War II single-handedly from a wheelchair in the Oval Office. So a lot of governments sort of said, we got to do better than this. And then after the war was won, government sort of fought back, led by a gentleman who was Secretary of the Navy at the time named James Forrestal, who basically pushed for what he thought was a good idea, was like, let's just get everybody in a room, all the big names in national security, so the president, the vice president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and a few others, to sort of talk about these issues, to make sure the country's thought through all the pieces of the equation, thought through all the risks, the pros, the cons, and then the president can sort of make a decision. So they created this council, which I think made sense in theory and on paper. But Congress sort of said, listen, if we're going to have this many big names coming to meetings, we need somebody to make sure they show up on time, that they know what they're talking about, and that somebody keeps track of what they say. And so they created a staff to help run the council and basically keep its papers moving. And that staff, from that little secretarial staff, and that's what they called it, a secretarial staff, has actually grown this remarkable institution in the middle of government that has 300 or 400 people on it. It's headed by the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and is really the leading and most important player in national security affairs. Whereas the council itself has grown less important because the president doesn't need a council or a forum to have these discussions when he has his own team, his own White House warriors to help him do it on the National Security Council staff.
And it's pretty incredible to think, too, when you discover what these people are all about, because you look at a world then that seemed to be simpler when it comes to foreign policy in some ways, because you had the Cold War to deal with in the 70s and into the 80s. And nowadays, it seems like it's more complex, especially when it comes to national security. Describe that sort of playing field nowadays versus, say, 30-plus years ago.
Well, it's always a running conversation. As a speechwriter at the Pentagon, this is one of these moments where you always, it's always easy to sort of overestimate the challenges we face as a country today and underestimate those from 30, 40 years ago, 70 years ago. So it's always a temptation, especially when you're writing speeches for the Secretary of Defense, to say this is the hardest, scariest, worst thing we've ever faced. And keeping that perspective is important, especially as you sort of keep things together. I mean, I think what we have now is what the folks back 70 years ago thought we needed, which was it's a much busier world, right? The United States, leading up to World War II, was able to disengage in some way from the global affairs, right? We're a little more, isolation is probably isn't the right term, but there was definitely a feeling of the world we're going to keep at arm's length. And the United States has since then had a pretty larger role in the world, in part because we have global interests, right? Whether it's peace and security, whether it's trade, whether it's Americans traveling all over the world to do business, to do missionary work, to do cultural and education, right? The United States has global interest. What we have now is a moment of just dramatic change, right? And so it's similar in some ways to the post-World War II era, where there was just a lot of change happening. Different powers were rising and falling relatively quickly. There were a lot new developments and technologies that were changing how everything worked. And it's a similar time in that way now, which is, the status quo is that we were sort of used to after the Cold War, and even during the global war on terror, the sort of heyday of the global war on terror, when you basically had 10 years where that was the biggest challenge we were facing, and all of the world was kind of focused on terrorism. You now have one where you have Russia sort of doing its provocations, you have nuclear proliferation in Korea and perhaps Iran and elsewhere. You have China's rise and all that sort of means. You have economic, powers rising and falling, whether it's Brazil or Japan or the United States. You have a lot of change. And so in theory, the National Security Council should be critical to that, because that is where all of these bureaucratic interests, right? The Secretary of Defense has one opinion, mostly focused on military matters. The Secretary of State has another opinion, mostly focused on diplomatic matters. The Secretary of the Treasury has an opinion, mostly focused on economic matters. So in theory, the staff should help bring those perspectives together into a coordinated and integrated foreign policy. But what I find in the book, White House Warriors, which looks at NSC staffers from Truman to Trump, is that very often there's less interest in that integrated view than in their own views winning the day. And so what you have is the staff should be the central port on foreign policy in terms of bringing everybody together. But because they pursue their own agendas more than they probably should, they've actually ended up pushing a lot of the sort of parts of government that need to come together in this challenging time away from the White House's view. And so it's deeply ineffective and counterproductive, in my opinion.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because one central figure that you have in a couple of chapters actually is that of Dick Cheney. And for those who aren't really familiar with, they ran out and they seen, the movie, of course, it's supposedly loosely based on his life, but I found him to be quite a character, because when you were talking about agendas, that people had their own personal winning the day way of doing this rather than being democratic like you're supposed to be and weighing through, conversation and so forth. What is the best course of action or decision, and then kind of leave it up to the president to decide this, which is essentially what should be happening, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, the way the whole system, in theory, but, and generally speaking, as somebody who worked in government, you do realize in a hurry that the president is the only one on national security that's really been elected. Because Congress plays so small a role on foreign policy matters, this entire national security bureaucracy between the military, the State Department, the intelligence community, and the international sort of economic matters, whether it's commerce, trade, and treasury, basically builds up to one person, right? And so that's the only way it sort of makes sense, and the only way you can think about using these dramatic weapons and things along those lines, right? Because one person is elected to make those decisions. That's the president. And so what you basically have is all the easy decisions get made at the low level. So as a speechwriter in the government, I got to make decisions about what goes in the Secretary of Defense's speeches. And sometimes I got feedback from the White House and then the National Security Advisor and, things along those lines. But at the end of the day, those weren't like go to the president decisions. But, as you work your way up into the harder and harder and harder decisions, and the best one, and I wrote a piece on this a few years ago for The Atlantic, was the bin Laden decision, which was the decision to raid into Pakistan to sort of secure Osama bin Laden, which, as Barack Obama, the president at the time, said, it was a 50-50 call, right? It was an impossibly difficult, high-stakes decision, but it was like 50-50 chance it worked out. Right, and so those are the hard decisions that sort of have to work their way up. But what you have is, and I always like to sort of explain this to people, which is, in some ways, national security is not that different than most workplaces, right? You have your colleagues, you have your good days and your bad days, you have days when you're bored, days when you're excited, days where you hate your boss, days where you love your boss, right? It's similar to that. But what you have, the two things that make it different are the ambition of the people who are there, right? You don't get to be Dick Cheney unless you have ambition, right? And really singular ambition, right? These are hard jobs that are stressful, take you away from your family, don't pay you that much. Nobody is poor working in government, but you certainly don't make as much as you could if you were a lawyer at a big law firm or working at Halliburton as Dick Cheney did for a while. And so the only reason you keep doing these time and time again, and what's interesting about this book is the number of times you see the same people popping back up, right? And so you see Dick Cheney coming through all the way, Bob Gates, who became Secretary of Defense and was Director of CIA, time and time again, Condi Rice. These are names that everybody knows now, but they have been working in government for decades.
Right.
And so what you find is the only reason you do that is if you have this level of ambition to help shape history, right? The second thing is that makes it a little bit different than your average workplace is the stakes, right? So it is a time where these are hard decisions full of risks and confusing data. And so you have this combination of a system that's supposed to drive decisions to the president or make sure those decisions are made well before they get there, ambitious people and high stakes. And that allows for people to really pursue their own agendas, like whether it's Dick Cheney did on Iraq, whether it's Bob Gates and those guys did on the Gulf War, whether it's Megan O'Sullivan is one staffer I profile who helped push, was one of the few people in government who wanted to do a surge in Iraq in 2006 and 2007, and she ended up pushing it all the way to the president, and he eventually agreed, right? These are people who basically decide, I have to take history into my hands, and it's an amazing thing, and something that is an amazing thing to watch, and I think they're good stories as a result of that. But they are, I think in a hurry, people would come away saying, well, is this the amount of power I want in this person's hands who I've never heard of, never voted for, and will never be confirmed by Congress? And that's the argument I make, which is you need an NSC staff to help integrate things, but you have to basically, with the level of power they have in today's Washington, they need to be confirmed by Congress and better known to the public.
And the reason I brought Dick Cheney up is to kind of show like a track that this person took, as you had described. These are people who have been in government for quite a long time, and Cheney goes all the way back to the Nixon administration. And I remembered how Nixon was actually being shackled on some of the decisions that he was making, especially regarding the Vietnam War, and how Cheney was seeing that he was being shackled by government, didn't feel that the president should have to be in a position to do that. He felt the president should have allegedly absolute power to make these decisions without having to be shackled by government and Congress and all that other nonsense, according to him. And so you can see progressing forward to 9/11 and the aftermath of that, how you had Dick Cheney there going, I'm going to ensure that this is going to happen now. I'm not going to see this happen. We're going to make these decisions and move forward. So you begin to see how things like that were shaped, even going back as early as the 1970s.
Yeah, and it's even going back longer than that, right? So if you look at what everybody what Franklin Roosevelt had, which was Roosevelt had a Cheney-esque view of how to fight wars, which was give all the power to the president and let him call the shots, and all of other government either needs to get in line or get out of the way, right? And so there's always this push and pull between the power, the presidency, and the government for who has the ultimate say and how much they share these decisions. And Franklin Roosevelt had a perspective. John Kennedy had a strong perspective for, I don't think many people would say John Kennedy and Dick Cheney have a lot in common, but they definitely had a view that being the sort of president who had all the power and the reins in their hand is what they both wanted. And Dick Cheney kind of came out of Watergate era and was not only, I think, for his own purposes interested in what, sometimes is called the unitary executive theory, like his idea that like the president is empowered and needs to have the power to run the executive branch, which includes war. But his basically view was that in a busy, crazy, dangerous world, that's the only way it works. And he pushed that in after Watergate, after the presidency was deeply weakened. He pushed that in outside of government when he was on Congress. He pushed it when he went into government again as Secretary of Defense, and he pushed it when he got back as Vice President, right? And so this is a constant push. And one of the things is Dick Cheney kind of, and the movie makes a big deal about that. But he's not the only one, right? There are a lot of people who think Frank Rooseveltian juggling was just fine with how policy was made. And they happen to usually be presidents. So, you could very easily see similar opinions about how policy should be made from Franklin Roosevelt to John Kennedy to Richard Nixon to George H.W. Bush to Barack Obama, right? That is a pretty straight line of opinion all through them. And the result is, an imperial presidency. People talked about that when you were growing up in Vietnam, but it's far more powerful than it was today than it was then. And the NSC is the reason why. And I think you actually see the proof in the pudding of how that doesn't necessarily make for better foreign policy, because I don't think the last 18 years have been a sterling record on foreign policy, especially in war. And so I don't think the imperial presidency is the best way to fight a war. And I think we've unfortunately had to live with the consequences of that in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And what's really unique, and for some reason as you were describing that, I was thinking back to the era of Jimmy Carter and then following Ronald Reagan. And the situation that we had going on there where we were trying to get our American hostages, out of Iran. And it was amazing because here we had this one crazy failed attempt for 2 helicopters crash in the desert to sneak in there and go try to grab our American hostages. And then it seemed all of a sudden as Reagan became president, here, take them. We didn't want them in the first place. It's like, how did that happen?
Well, if you recall, Carter put a lot of effort into getting them back. No,
I wasn't undermining that, but you kind of see as you step back, and look at the big picture, like was Reagan that maniacal that they just said here? What was really going on?
Well, I think a few things. I think the way this stuff, I always try to remember things, is that we tend to have a very singular view from our perspective in the United States about what these countries are doing, and that foreign policy is driven
we can't
by
blame it. Look at our news media; they cannot
show
us what they want to, and then you look a little bit deeper, and you realize, well, wait a minute, I didn't get that information. That's why I say, listen to us as a starting point, but certainly move and do your own homework. Don't just take us as the gospel. That's my opinion anyway. So.
Yeah, exactly. That's my opinion too, and that's why I wrote the books, because I think too few people understand the government. But Iran's a perfect example. Iran has had its own foreign policy agenda for since for as long as Iran's existed. But when the revolution had happened, one of the things they wanted was their own sort of own control of their own foreign policy. And so you had one of those situations where, Iran had 1,000 different interests playing out, and they evolved from 79 to 80 to 81, and that included the war with Iraq, which is a footnote in American history, but is still probably the most consequential thing that's ever happened in the Middle East, right, in the post-World War II Middle East. And so it's one of those ones where, there were always different elements within Iran that were sort of playing the United States in different ways, and you sort of see that consequence, whether it was they really almost wrecked two American presidencies between Jimmy Carter and the Desert One raid and the hostages then, and then the Iran-Contra affair, which was another instance where the NSC was centrally involved. And the NSC was centrally involved in Desert One, in the hostage negotiations, and then in Iran-Contra. And it's an amazing thing to see how America's foreign policy has been shaped by a few staffers, and how, especially just with one country like Iran. And I think I track a few of those through the book. Vietnam's a perfect example. The staffers driving America deeper into Vietnam, and then desperately trying to find a way out, including by bombing the daylights out of Vietnam, to Iran, which is a story that starts in the book, I think, in 1972 or 73, and how that situation in Iraq. These are, America's been fighting or dealing with Iraq for almost 30 years now, and that's a staggering length of time for us to be engaged with the country. And it's partly due to the NSC staff that we've had this long-running standoff with that country.
Well, someday we hope there's going to be a solution to all of that. But you can see the entanglement again as you look deeper into what's going on, because I remember that after 9/11, that when we were over in Iraq to actually, kind of straighten things out and maybe help them to get a government established, that seemed to be kind of a mess in and of itself, and that seemed to be what the frustration of the citizens that were living there had. It's like, okay, we're welcoming the United States in, but now we're starting to feel like we're being shut out. Now we can't go anywhere. There was, just a lot of things going on that a lot of people just really didn't know about.
Yeah, I mean, these are the American country, the United States has tried to remake two countries in the past 20 years, and if we've learned anything, it's that it's not as easy as it looks. And yet there are still people here today who talk about Iran and regime change and things along those lines, including at the highest levels of government and the National Security Council with John Bolton, right? So it's a very it's a hard lesson to I guess make stick, but it's certainly one that I would have thought we would have learned by now.
Now, just to let people know, you've done more than 100 interviews, including 12 national security advisors, which is, pretty astonishing when you think about the kind of ways that you can look at things, because each one of them, as we've kind of given the clear view about, has had sort of a personal motivation. I brought up Henry Kissinger earlier because I was growing up in grade school as a kid when he was, considered the most intelligent man on planet Earth and, great foreign policy negotiator, things like that. But when you find out more about Henry Kissinger, he actually also kind of considered himself to be a rock star.
Yeah.
That you look at his motivations were pretty well ego-driven, and so you have to realize why things turn out the way they do comes from a personal, motivation and set of circumstances that lead us in this direction. So you can see, as you were mentioning earlier about Vietnam, we're just going to end it all. Let's just drop some nukes and call it a day.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to see what people are willing to do to sort of chase their own future and to try and help do the different things that they think is in the best interest of the country, but is really in their own best interest. And, as I would like to point out, and I've told people this several times, Henry Kissinger came into government in 1969 and actually hadn't worked in government very much. And so he ended up getting the charge of the NSC. And basically ended up breaking government with Richard Nixon's help to try and which is kind of an astonishing thing and really scary if you think about it. I think that the country paid the consequences, yet Henry Kissinger never really has, which is kind of a shame, and is still considered one of the wisest men in Washington, which is kind of amazing. And I think
I like that you use the word like I thought. It is kind of amazing. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, he helped. I always like to make clear to people. I was at an event yesterday in Chicago on the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, and we had a nice group there. And I sort of said, "Does anybody know where Watergate started?" And people sort of say, it's amazing how few people actually understand Watergate, even though we sort of talk about it a lot today. And I sort of said it started with the bugging of one of the members of the National Security Council staff, that Henry Kissinger was the driving force behind bugging a person. And, that started the bugging and started the effort to use the government against itself and its own citizens that eventually became the sort of the Watergate burglary represented. But it's an astonishing thing that Henry Kissinger is still considered such a wise man, and he's pops up again and again in the book, which is kind of crazy.
Well, no, I like it because you see, for instance, let's just use a contrast. This is what I liked about how you wrote this. Is you look at Dick Cheney, and he has, in a way, a linear goal that leads right to the decisions that were made post 9/11. You go, okay, this makes sense. You can see he's kind of looking out for the country, that sort of a thing, and believes this should actually happen. So we're not scrambled and waiting in case we need to maybe move on something. But you look at Kissinger, and he's just sort of an opportunist. He's just picking and plucking the fruit wherever he thinks it's the freshest and lowest hanging in some ways. And so you kind of see and feel that picture emerging just from these two individuals.
Yeah, I mean it's an amazing thing. I mean the psychodrama between Kissinger and Nixon was really astonishing, and I mean there are whole parts of the world like Cambodia that are still showing the consequences of the two of them trying to win a war single-handedly, and America's trust in government has gone up and down, but I don't think anybody ever trusted government the same way after Watergate.
Well, I'm certain of that, definitely.
And so you end up in a situation where these two people have done all of this work, and they did it with the help of the National Security Council. And that's one of the many war stories I tell in this book, right? So from Vietnam to Iraq, from Korea really to Iraq, and and to today. And so, what I wrote this book to do is try to help people understand that these people are there right now. There's NSC staffers helping John Bolton doing things that we don't know. And some secrecy is important in government, but unfortunately it's been used by a lot of people throughout history to help steer America in a place where it probably shouldn't be. And that's a shame and something to keep an eye out for.
Now, with the few minutes that we have left, what are your thoughts about the current administration? Because, this is where you start hearing things such as, there's a deep state that's out there to get a hold and take down Trump. Well, that's no different than Bill Clinton, and it goes back. But so what are your thoughts, in doing the research and putting this book out there about the current administration and the NSC there?
I think that the NSC has been sort of one example of the sort of collision between the sort of Donald Trump's sort of irregularity and unconventionality. Never served in government, never served in the military. So, it was always going to be like a tough fit for him because it's such a particular way of doing things. But, the way he's managed and the people he's put in charge there has not helped him any. So, he starts off by putting Michael Flynn, who was close aide to him on the campaign, but obviously Michael Flynn had a terrible reputation in national security. He had basically been fired by the Obama administration as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then was basically put in charge of all of government's national security stuff. So it's kind of odd for somebody like that to get given the job, and government reacted very badly. I mean, I think Michael Flynn represented a lot of what Donald Trump meant to government, it was something a lot of people in government worried about and feared, and the conflict between what Trump brought in and the people Trump put in place was violent. I mean, it was an amazing thing in the first January, February of 2017, and the people after Michael Flynn left, like H.R. McMaster and John Bolton, have done a better job of probably helping translate Donald Trump to the rest of government, but it has not been an easy fit. And unfortunately, with John Bolton, he's taken the opportunity to sort of disengage and break a lot of the policy process down from what it was when Donald Trump showed up. And that has led to a situation where there's less process, less transparency and less clarity in terms of what's being decided and what isn't, because it's only being done by a few people with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. And every president should get what they need in terms to make the decisions. But I don't think there's many people who would say that Donald Trump should have less process around them, in part because, this is how you learn and this is how you make sound decisions. And so I think we have a lot to worry about in terms of how the current administration is handling the NSC.
I'm going to let the listeners know this is a wonderful book. It's called White House Warriors. It's how the National Security Council transformed the American way of war. Very well researched, the interviews, the way everything comes through. It really gives you a better perspective than the one that most of us get, which is you watch TV, the evening news, and you think, okay, that's the way it is. And it's like, no, you got to go a lot deeper than that. You got to understand why a president's good at negotiating when you realize that perhaps he was a hell of a poker player. Just got to go a little bit deeper than that. And I want to thank you, John, for taking the time to join us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Now, is there a website people can find out more about your work and how they can get the book, things like that?
Yeah, you can check me out. My website's johngans.com, which is JOHNGANS.com. But you can also find the book just about anywhere. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and, been doing a lot of writing at The Atlantic and CNN and elsewhere. So you can find me anywhere, and I'm definitely trying to get out there to make sure people know about the book so that they can learn a little bit more about government, because I think it's an important one. And these stories are too important for Americans not to understand.
I completely agree with you. John, thank you again for being on the program.
Thank you so much.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.